The morning was quiet, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that didn't comfort, didn't soothe. It pressed against the walls like an old regret, heavy and still Sarah. Prescott, 56, stood by the window of the home she had shared with Mark for 28 years. The house was tidy, too tidy, like it had been waiting for something to go wrong. Or perhaps for someone to finally see that it already had. It was their wedding anniversary. Or it would have been if Mark remembered. He hadn't for the last 4 years, and Sarah told herself not to expect anything different this time. Still, habit was a stubborn thing. She had risen before dawn like she always used to. The coffee was brewing strong black, just how he liked it. The scent filled the kitchen, mixed with the smoky crispness of bacon sizzling in the cast-iron skillet. The one he swore made it taste like his childhood. She scrambled the eggs with a dash of cream, buttered the toast just right, and even placed a tiny sprig of rosemary beside his plate. She didn't do it for him, not anymore. She did it because it was the only thing left that still made her feel like herself. As she set the table, smoothing out the linen napkin like she had 100 times before, her eyes flicked to the phone sitting on the counter. No text, no call, just the low ding from the living room. Mark's social media post. She didn't rush to check it, but her fingers moved before her mind could catch up. And within seconds, she was staring at a picture of him grinning in the gym mirror, captioned, "Still grinding, no days off." No mention of her. No mention of the woman who had held his world together for nearly 3 decades. She stood frozen in the doorway, the warmth of the skillet behind her, a stark contrast to the ice forming in her chest. Mark sauntered into the kitchen a minute later, smelling the food, stretching like a man satisfied with his domain. He didn't kiss her, didn't greet her, just sniffed the air and muttered, "Smells good. Flip the toast better next time, though." That was it. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply walked to the counter and reached behind the flour canister where she had hidden a simple white envelope. She placed it beside his fork with the same care she used when packing her children's lunches decades ago. Mark didn't notice it at first. He took a bite of bacon, then reached for his juice and caught sight of the envelope. "What's this?" he asked, his tone light, chuckling like it might be a surprise card. He opened it. His fork paused mid-air. "Sarah?" he said, eyes narrowing. "What the hell is this?" She looked him dead in the eye, steady as stone. "It's your breakfast, and your future." Inside the envelope were divorce papers, neatly printed, legally bound, and as cold as the look on her face. He laughed. It was shaky. "Forced. You're joking. Come on, this again. You're really doing this over a date." Sarah's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "It's not just a date, Mark. It's 5 years of forgotten vows. It's 30 years of being invisible." He rubbed his temples, already irritated. "We have a good life." "No, you have a good life." "I have a routine. I have silence. I have a man who treats me like background noise." Mark stood up, the old fire in his eyes. But it didn't scare her anymore. "You're being dramatic." Sarah picked up her plate calmly and walked past him without flinching. "No, Mark, I'm being honest." She climbed the stairs to the bedroom they hadn't shared in over a year. Her heart wasn't racing. It wasn't breaking. It was just done. Downstairs, the scent of bacon lingered, growing cold. The morning after the divorce papers, Sarah woke before the sun. She could hear the faint sound of Mark's snoring from the other side of the house, but she didn't bother to check the time. It had never mattered to him before, so why should it matter to her now? The kitchen was empty when she made her coffee. She didn't bother with breakfast. The house felt quieter than it ever had before, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something that had already happened. Sarah sat at the table, staring out the window. The neighbor's dog was chasing its tail in circles, oblivious to the change that had taken place in the world of the woman inside. She hadn't cried, not yet, and she didn't know if she ever would. The silence was broken by the familiar, yet now alien sound of Mark's footsteps. He shuffled into the kitchen, his eyes barely glancing at her as he grabbed a protein shake from the fridge and slurped it down with his usual indifference. His gym bag was at the door, his phone buzzing in his pocket with notifications. He didn't even look her way. "You good?" he asked, barely making eye contact. Sarah's lips tightened. "I'm fine." The days felt endless. The divorce papers weren't just an announcement to Mark. They were an announcement to herself. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the woman who held everything together while everyone else lived their lives no more. By the next afternoon, she had made a decision. She was going to the attic. The stairs creaked beneath her as she climbed to the dark space she had avoided for so long. Dust and memories swirled in the air. The attic smelled like cedar and time of years of things left behind. Mark had always insisted that she leave it alone. "It's my stuff," he would say. "Don't touch anything." But today, Sarah didn't care. She didn't have to care anymore. There, hidden behind an old bookshelf stacked with boxes of fishing gear and forgotten holiday decorations, was a small gray box. She recognized it immediately. It was the one Mark had always told her not to open, the one that had been tucked away since before they even married. Her hands shook as she pulled it out from the shadows, sitting cross-legged on the attic floor. She stared at the battered latch for a moment before opening it. It clicked softly, and Sarah found herself staring at a pile of letters, dozens of them. Some were yellowed with age, their corners folded and creased. She pulled one out, her breath catching in her throat. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began. It was Mark's handwriting, but it wasn't addressed to her. Her heart dropped. She flipped through a few more letters, each one more intimate than the last Mark had written to her, to Evelyn. Before they met, during their engagement, even after they were married, the letters were full of longing, of promises made to a woman Sarah didn't know. But the one thing that stood out above all was the recurring theme. "I will never stop loving you." She couldn't breathe. The ground beneath her seemed to tilt, and for a moment, she was back in their living room, watching him scroll through his phone, ignoring her presence. But this was worse. This wasn't just his indifference. It was a betrayal hidden in plain sight, a secret buried in the attic where it had remained for years. Sarah dug deeper into the box, her hands trembling. Then she found something that made her heart stop. A birth certificate. A baby girl, born 6 months after their engagement. Her name was Emily Harper, and the father was Mark. Her mind raced. The girl had been placed for adoption. Mark had fathered a child before they even met, and he had never told her, not once. Her pulse was loud in her ears as she grabbed the papers. She didn't know how long she stayed there, in the attic, reading and rereading the details. Her world crumbling with every word. She felt like a fool, a ghost, invisible to a man who had never truly seen her. Mark came home later that night. He dropped his gym bag by the door, his usual grumble about the gym routine falling flat when he saw Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, the adoption papers and letters spread out before her. He looked at the documents, then back at her, his face going pale. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, strained. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She just stared at him, really stared, seeing the gray in his hair, the wrinkles in his eyes, the man who had once promised her the world, but had only given her silence. "Who's Evelyn?" she finally asked, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Mark's eyes widened. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't have to. The panic was all over his face. "Answer me!" Sarah demanded, her voice colder than she'd ever heard it. He swallowed, running a hand through his hair. "It was before. Before us, I was young. I made mistakes." "No." Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. "You didn't make mistakes. You made choices, and I wasn't one of them." Mark tried to reach for her, but she stood up, backing away from him. "You hid this from me. For how long, Mark?" 30 years of marriage, and you never thought I deserved to know." He opened his mouth to say something, but she was done. She was done with the lies, done with the waiting. "You never cared about me. Not like you cared about her," Sarah said quietly, almost to herself. "You never saw me. Not really." Mark stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low. "This is just dramatic." Sarah didn't flinch. "I've been invisible for long enough. It's your turn." She turned and walked up the stairs, leaving him standing in the kitchen with the truth he had buried. Sarah lay in their empty bed that night, wide awake. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. She could hear Mark's breathing from the other room, but it felt as distant as the life they had shared. A life built on secrets, silence, and unspoken promises. She had always been the quiet one, the one who did everything without asking for much in return. But now, in the stillness of the house, she realized that being silent had kept her small, invisible. She had sacrificed pieces of herself for the sake of keeping the peace, for the sake of maintaining a life that no longer felt like hers. The divorce papers were still sitting on the kitchen table. Mark hadn't touched them since that morning. He hadn't spoken much since then either, just pacing around the house, making calls, sending a few texts. Sarah didn't care. He could do whatever he wanted. She wasn't his wife anymore, not in any meaningful way. In the hours that followed, Sarah didn't cry. She didn't feel the need to. It was as if all the tears she had saved for years had been used up, leaving only an unsettling calm. She went through the motions of the day, a quiet breakfast coffee that was too strong, and then a trip to the attic to the box that had revealed the lies. She stared at the adoption papers again, still in disbelief. The child, he had given up the child who was his, but not hers. A daughter he had kept hidden from her, just like everything else. That afternoon, Sarah did something she had never done before. She went through the house, through the rooms they had shared for decades, and began to pack her things. She wasn't leaving, not yet, but she was reclaiming her space. The years of sacrifice, the years of being there without being seen, had to end. The room that had once been hers, the one she had filled with family photos, children's drawings, and the remnants of their life together, was now just an echo. She took down the photographs. The wedding picture that had once made her smile now felt like a cruel reminder of who she had been, a woman who had given everything for a family that had forgotten her. She moved through the house, taking down the knickknacks, the framed pictures, the things that had meant something once. They didn't have to go to the trash, but they didn't have to stay either. She put them all in a box, and when the house felt emptier than it ever had, she felt something stir within her, something she hadn't felt in years. The tiniest flicker of freedom. When she came across the letters, the ones from Evelyn, she tucked them away. There was no need to confront Mark, not yet. She wasn't ready for that, but she would be. Eventually, Sarah made her way back to the kitchen later that evening, noticing that Mark had left again. His gym bag was by the door, but he was nowhere to be found. She didn't mind. He could stay gone for all she cared. She opened the fridge, pulling out the wine that had been sitting there for months untouched. Tonight, she would drink it alone. With the glass in hand, She sat at the table. Her thoughts were tangled, but there was one thing that stood out more than anything else. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the woman who cleaned up after everyone else, the one who made the meals, washed the clothes, and tended to the house. She wasn't that woman anymore. She was her own woman. As the evening dragged on, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on everything she had done over the years, the sacrifices, the endless giving. She had put her dreams aside to build Mark's. She had stepped back so he could shine, so he could be the man everyone admired. And she had let herself fade into the background until there was nothing left of her but the faintest echo of who she had been. But now, she was done. The next morning, she didn't wake up before the sun. She didn't rush to make breakfast or set the table. She didn't feel the need to. She let the morning come to her, and when Mark finally stumbled down the stairs, she was already in the kitchen, sipping her coffee calm and collected. He looked at her with surprise, as if he couldn't understand what had changed. "You didn't make breakfast?" he asked, his voice laced with the same disinterest as always. "No," she said quietly, not looking up. "I didn't." Mark was silent for a moment, and Sarah could feel the tension building between them. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even resentment. It was something far more powerful. Detachment. She wasn't looking to fight. She wasn't looking to argue. She was simply done. He finally broke the silence. "You're really going through with this, aren't you?" "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. He stood there, waiting for something more, for an explanation, for an emotional outburst. But Sarah had no more words for him. "Not anymore." "Fine," he said finally. "But I don't understand." Sarah set down her coffee mug and looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like ages. "You don't need to understand. You never did." With that, she turned back to the window, watching the day unfold like a blank canvas. She had no idea where the path would lead her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't care. She would figure it out. She would rebuild, not just the house, but herself. And this time, no one would forget her. The next few days passed like slow-moving clouds, each one heavy with its own weight. Sarah didn't rush into anything. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, she had the space to breathe without having to apologize for taking it. Mark was still around, still coming and going as he always had. But there was a distance now, a gulf between them that hadn't existed before. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional. The house, once a place of routine and shared life, now felt like a battleground, silent but charged with unspoken words. That evening, as the sun began to set, Sarah found herself standing in front of the bookshelf in the living room, staring at the neatly arranged photo albums. They were the memories of a life she had given everything to build. She had filled them with photos of birthday parties, anniversaries, and vacations. But now, as she pulled one down, it felt like a collection of someone else's life. Someone who had once been loved, once been seen, but had faded into the background of someone else's story. She opened the first page, running her fingers along the edges of the photos. There she was, young, vibrant, full of dreams she had long since forgotten. Her wedding day, her children's first birthdays, family trips to the beach. There had been so much joy once, so much promise. But now, those images felt like ghosts, faces frozen in time, their smiles hollow. Sarah closed the album with a soft sigh. She wasn't sure if it was sadness or relief that filled her, but she knew one thing for certain. It was time to stop living in the past. It was time to move forward. The thought lingered with her as she spent the next few days sorting through her things. She was cleaning out the house, yes,
But it wasn't just about decluttering.
It was about reclaiming the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. She packed away the items that had defined her life with Mark, the ones that represented the woman she had been, the woman she had allowed herself to become in the shadow of his neglect. And then there was the box. It was still in the corner of the attic gathering dust. The box that had revealed the truth about Mark's secret life. The one he had kept hidden for so long. Sarah had been avoiding it, afraid of what else it might contain. But now she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. The attic smelled of old wood and forgotten memories as Sarah pulled the box out of the corner, her hands shaking. She had spent so many years turning a blind eye, accepting the life she had, even when it wasn't the life she wanted. But now, she wasn't afraid to face the truth. She opened it slowly, hesitantly, as if the contents might bite back. Inside, she found more letters, more photographs. But this time, there was something else. A set of papers. Adoption papers. The name was familiar. Emily Harper, the same name she had seen before. The same daughter Mark had given up years ago. The one he had never told her about. But there was something new now, an address, a place Sarah could find her. Emily wasn't just a name anymore. She was a person, a daughter, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if she was the one who had been truly abandoned. For the first time in years, Sarah felt something stir inside her, a sense of purpose, a desire to reclaim the things she had lost. Emily wasn't just a secret from the past. She was the key to Sarah's own future. The next day, Sarah drove to the address. She didn't know what she would find there, didn't know what she was even looking for, but she knew she had to go. She had to know who this girl was, who she could have been in her life. The road was long, winding through countryside and small towns, but Sarah didn't mind. She felt calm, more alive than she had in years. It wasn't about finding answers, not really. It was about taking back control. When she finally arrived, the place was quiet. A simple cottage nestled among trees. She sat in her car for a long moment, watching the front door, wondering what to do next. Should she knock? Should she wait for Emily to come to her? Eventually, Sarah made her decision. She got out of the car, walking slowly toward the front door, her heart beating in her chest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn, and everything felt still, as if the world was holding its breath. Before she could knock, the door opened, and there she was. Emily. She was older than Sarah had expected, late 20s maybe. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple sweater and jeans, like someone who had never known the weight of luxury. She smiled when she saw Sarah, but it was hesitant, unsure. "Can I help you?" Emily asked, her voice soft, but wary. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't sure what to say, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to walk away. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I think you're my husband's daughter." Emily's eyes widened. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped back, motioning for Sarah to come inside. Sarah did, following her into the modest home that smelled faintly of pine and lavender. The silence between them was thick, filled with years of unspoken words. Emily sat down on the couch, her hands clasped together in her lap. "So," Emily said finally, her voice quiet. "You're the woman he married?" Sarah nodded. "Yes." "I didn't know about you. I found out recently." Emily didn't say anything, just stared at her for a moment, as if weighing something in her mind. Finally, she spoke again. "You came all this way to find me?" she asked. Sarah's eyes softened. "I didn't come to find you. I came to find the truth." I think we both deserve that." Emily looked away, her face pale. "I don't know what to say. I never knew about you either. I've lived with this silence for so long." "And I've lived with it for even longer," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "But I'm done being quiet, and I think you should be too." They sat in silence for a while longer, both of them unsure of how to bridge the gap that had existed between them for so long. But in that silence, something shifted, something unspoken yet understood. It wasn't the end of their story, but it was the beginning of something new. The days that followed felt like a delicate unraveling. Sarah wasn't sure what to expect from Emily or what Emily expected from her. She had driven all this way, opened old wounds, and yet she still wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But there was something in the way Emily had looked at her, something tentative and raw, that made Sarah feel that this was a beginning, not an end. Emily had invited Sarah to stay for tea. It was simple, humble, and when they sat down at the kitchen table, there was a strange sense of familiarity between them. The silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It was just two women trying to figure out how to fill in the blanks that had been left in their lives by a man who had chosen to erase them both. "How much do you know about him?" Emily asked after a few moments, her voice barely above a whisper. She was looking down at her cup, her fingers nervously tracing the rim. "Only what I've found," Sarah replied, her voice steady but heavy. "I didn't know about you. He never told me." Emily let out a short laugh, a bitter sound that didn't quite match the warmth of the room. "He never told anyone, did he?" Sarah shook her head. "I think it's just easier for him to pretend things didn't happen." They were both silent for a long moment, the weight of shared loss hanging in the air like a thick fog. The hurt was too fresh for them to understand fully, but the seed of understanding was there. They had both been discarded in different ways and at different times, but both had spent too long in the shadows. "You don't have to tell me anything," Sarah said softly, "but I think you deserve to know why I came here. I didn't come to accuse. I didn't come to hurt you. I came because—" She paused, looking down at her hands, suddenly unsure. "I came because I finally realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about us." Emily met her gaze for the first time, her eyes searching Sarah's face, as if trying to read something she didn't understand. "Us." Sarah nodded slowly. "You've been invisible for so long, Emily. Just like I have. And I spent years thinking I was the only one who'd been forgotten. But I wasn't, and I wanted to change that." Emily didn't respond immediately, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. But after a moment, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I don't even know what to do with all of this." "I know," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "Neither do I. But I don't want you to go through your life feeling like you don't matter, because you do." There was a long silence between them, one filled with the soft sound of the wind outside and the distant hum of the house. Emily's eyes flickered with something Sarah couldn't quite read, but it wasn't hostility. It was more like a careful sort of curiosity, as if Emily was wondering if this woman in front of her could possibly mean what she said. "I don't want to be a secret anymore," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She wiped her eyes, almost as if she hadn't realized she was crying. "I don't know how to start. I don't know where to go from here." Sarah felt a sharp pang in her chest. She had asked herself the same question so many times. But now, sitting across from Emily, she realized something crucial. There was no roadmap for this kind of relationship, no guidebook for being the mother of someone you never knew existed, or for being the daughter of someone who never knew you at all. "We don't have to figure it all out today," Sarah said gently. "But we can start small. We can start with the truth, and we can take it from there." Over the next few days, Sarah and Emily began to carve out a new kind of relationship. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. They shared stories of their lives, their pain, their joys. Sarah talked about her years with Mark, the way she had given everything to a man who had never truly seen her. Emily shared what little she knew about her birth mother, about the years spent in foster care, and the hollow ache of growing up without ever really knowing where she came from. And slowly but surely, Sarah realized that this wasn't just about Mark anymore. It wasn't about the man who had kept them apart, who had hidden the truth, who had spent decades living in the comfort of his own lies. It was about what Sarah could rebuild for herself and for Emily. One afternoon, as they sat together in Emily's kitchen, sipping tea and talking about everything and nothing, Emily suddenly turned to her with a hesitant look on her face. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but determined. "I know I've been distant, and I'm sorry for that. I didn't know how to trust anyone. Not after everything, but I want to try. I want to really try with you." Sarah smiled, her heart light. "We'll take it slow. But yes, I'd like that." In that moment, Sarah realized that the real healing wasn't going to come from confronting Mark or from chasing down every lie he had ever told. It wasn't going to come from revenge or regret. The healing was already happening. It was happening quietly in these small moments of connection, in the way they could sit together, share the silence, and know that it wasn't a silence filled with resentment. It was a silence filled with possibility. The weeks that followed were filled with more of the quiet, gradual changes that had begun when Sarah first decided to stop being invisible. The house felt different now, lighter, less suffocating. Mark was still absent most of the time, disappearing to the gym or his endless social obligations, leaving Sarah to settle into a rhythm that was hers alone. She didn't rush to confront him. He had left her with enough to process, enough to understand. Confrontation would come in time, but for now, she focused on herself. It was an unfamiliar feeling, not having to be everything for everyone. She could go for walks without wondering if anyone would notice. She could spend afternoons reading on the couch, sipping tea and savoring the quiet without guilt. Emily continued to visit, and while their relationship was still in its infancy, Sarah could feel it growing. There were moments of lightness, of laughter, and even shared memories of the past. Emily had started calling her mom, a name that felt strange but right. It was a small word, but it was a powerful one, and Sarah was learning how to wear it. But not everyone understood. Not everyone saw the shift happening in Sarah's life. One Saturday afternoon, as Sarah sat at her kitchen table flipping through old recipe books, her phone buzzed with a message from Lauren, her daughter. It had been months since they'd spoken in any meaningful way. They had exchanged the occasional pleasantries, but nothing deep, nothing real. "Mom, we need to talk about Emily." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The last time they had talked about Emily was when Lauren had been hesitant, cautious, like she didn't know what to make of her own daughter's newfound connection with Sarah. It hadn't sat right with her then, and it didn't sit right now. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she set the phone down, staring at the screen for a moment before making her decision. This wasn't about appeasing anyone anymore. It was about her own life, her own choices. A few hours later, there was a knock at the door. Sarah opened it to find Lauren standing on the porch, looking like she had come straight from a business meeting, too polished, too perfect, too removed. "Hi, Mom," Lauren said, her smile forced. "Can we talk?" "Sure," Sarah replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Come on in." Lauren didn't sit immediately. Instead, she stood by the door, her arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. Sarah could tell that she wasn't sure what to expect, whether to expect anger or guilt or something else entirely. But Sarah wasn't angry. She was done being angry. She was just done. "I heard you've been spending a lot of time with Emily." Lauren, said her voice cool, but Sarah could hear the edge beneath the words. I don't get it, Mom. Why now? Why her? Because she's my daughter. Sarah said simply, her voice steady. She didn't have to explain. She didn't have to justify. And she's not just his secret anymore. Lauren's face flushed with discomfort, but she pressed on. But you gave up so much for us, for me, and now you're just going to throw it all away for her. Sarah blinked, surprised by the bitterness that laced Lauren's words. I didn't throw anything away, Lauren. I gave everything, and I'm finally realizing that I deserve something back. I deserve to be seen. Lauren opened her mouth to speak, but Sarah raised her hand, stopping her. And so does Emily. The words hung in the air like a challenge, like a truth that neither of them could deny. The silence stretched between them before Lauren sighed, her shoulders sagging in defeat. You're right, Lauren finally said, her voice low. I don't know. I didn't want to lose you too. Sarah's heart softened. She could hear the fear in her daughter's voice, the same fear she had felt all those years ago, when her own mother had become a distant figure. But this time, Sarah wouldn't shrink. This time, she wouldn't fade into the background. I'm not going anywhere, Lauren, Sarah said quietly. But I can't keep living for you, or for anyone else. Lauren was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in her mind. She wasn't sure if Lauren would ever fully understand, but she wasn't going to wait for her to. This wasn't about waiting to be chosen. This was about choosing herself. Mom, Lauren said finally, her voice small. I just want to know you're okay. I am, Sarah replied, meeting her daughter's eyes. I'm more than okay. I'm free. The following week, Sarah went to the post office. She had made a decision. She couldn't just sit back anymore. The truth was, her life had never truly been her own until now. She had always been defined by her role as a mother, a wife, a caretaker, but never as Sarah. She had stopped replying to the calls and texts from Mark. He had tried to reach her a few times, but each time she just let it ring. She wasn't interested in his apologies. She wasn't interested in his explanations. The life she had with him was over, and it had ended long before she had signed those divorce papers. The truth was, Sarah had spent so long fighting for him to see her, to recognize her worth. But now, it was time to stop fighting. It was time to reclaim the parts of herself that had been buried beneath years of sacrifice and silence. She sent the letter to Emily. It wasn't long, just a few words, but they were enough. Emily, I'm so proud of you. No matter what happens, you will always have a place in my heart. We'll figure this out together, but for now, I'm living my life, and it's the best decision I've ever made. The letter wasn't about closure. It wasn't about explaining herself. It was a declaration, a promise to herself and to the daughter she had never known she had. And when the envelope dropped into the post office box, Sarah knew that she had done something no one else could do for her. She had taken the first step toward her new life, and she was going to walk it no more, looking back. Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror that evening, the soft light of the setting sun streaming through the window behind her. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her, not because of her age, not because of the lines etched into her face, but because she had finally stopped looking for validation in others. She had stopped measuring her worth by how others saw her. For the first time in years, she saw herself clearly. Her hair was graying now, and there were wrinkles by her eyes. But these were the marks of someone who had lived, who had loved, who had given her everything. And for the first time, she was proud of those marks. They weren't signs of weakness or failure. They were signs of resilience. She had spent so much time hiding, pretending to be the woman everyone needed her to be. Wife, mother, caretaker. But now she realized she had been missing the most important role of all herself.
The next few days were filled with a quiet kind of excitement. Sarah didn't rush to tell Mark what had happened, or to demand explanations for his years of neglect. She didn't need to anymore. He was still out there, doing whatever he did, but she wasn't concerned. She was finally focused on something that mattered, her own life. It felt strange at first, taking time for herself, without the nagging sense of guilt that had always followed her. She spent her mornings walking through the park, taking in the sights and sounds of the world she had ignored for too long. She finally went to a cafe she had always wanted to try, but had never felt worthy of before. She sat at the window with a book in her lap, sipping coffee and watching the world go by. There was a freedom in the small things that had once been insignificant, but now felt like precious victories. But then, just as Sarah was starting to feel like she was regaining her footing, there was a knock at the door. She didn't have to guess who it was. Mark stood in the doorway, his face flushed, his hair a little disheveled. He looked smaller somehow, like the man who had once been the center of her world had been chipped away bit by bit, leaving only a shell of the person he had once been. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice a mixture of annoyance and concern. "I haven't been avoiding you," Sarah replied, her voice calm. "I've just been living." Mark stood there blinking, as if Sarah's words were foreign to him.
"What does that mean exactly?" "It means I'm done." "Mark," Sarah said, her eyes steady, her heart sure. "Done pretending. Done waiting. Done being invisible. I'm not your background anymore." He opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not angry," she continued, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not here to fight. I'm just done, and I'm okay with that." Mark stood there for a long moment, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, Sarah didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need his approval. "You really are serious, aren't you?" Mark finally asked, his voice distant, as if the realization had just hit him. "I am," Sarah replied simply. "And I'm going to be just fine." There was nothing left to say, nothing more to argue about. Mark opened his mouth as if to protest, but then closed it again, his shoulders sagging. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door. For the first time in ages, Sarah felt something shift inside of her. It wasn't joy or relief. It wasn't even triumph. It was something deeper, something more powerful. It was peace, and it was hers. A few days later, Sarah got a message from Emily. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it was a small moment that felt monumental to Sarah. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day." The message read, "I want to start painting again. I know it's not the same as what we're talking about, but I feel like I've been hiding too, and I don't want to do that anymore." Sarah smiled as she read the message, her heart swelling. She hadn't just given Emily the truth. She had given her permission to live, to be seen, to claim her own space in the world. It was a small step, but it was the first one. The weeks passed, and Sarah found herself beginning to embrace a new rhythm, a new pace. She hadn't expected it to be easy, and it wasn't. But it was hers. Her life. Her choices, her boundaries. One afternoon, Emily called to ask if they could meet for lunch. Sarah agreed, of course. They sat at a small cafe in town, just the two of them. The conversation was easy, more like two old friends catching up than two women trying to figure out how to be in each other's lives. And then, as they were finishing their meal, Emily surprised her. "I want you to meet someone," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "I've been seeing someone, and I'd like you to meet him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She didn't know what to expect,
but she found herself smiling, her heart opening in a way it hadn't in years. "I'd love to," Sarah said, her voice warm. "I'm really happy for you, Emily." As they parted ways, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new text from her daughter Lauren. "I've been thinking about what you said. I'm sorry I don't fully understand everything, but I'm trying." For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like her family was beginning to see her. Not for what they wanted her to be, not for what they needed her to be, but for who she truly was. And she knew that no matter what happened, this was just the beginning of a new chapter. That evening, as the sun set, Sarah stood on the porch of her small cottage, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what she had imagined for her life, but it was real. And for the first time in years, she felt whole. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was unforgettable. The days that followed were quieter, more peaceful. It wasn't that Sarah had all the answers. It wasn't that everything was magically fixed. But for the first time in decades, she felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders, piece by piece. No longer bound by the expectations of others, no longer invisible in her own life. Sarah began to reclaim the joy and freedom that had been hers long ago. She spent more time with Emily. It was different now, less awkward, less tentative. There were moments of quiet understanding, of shared silence that spoke louder than words. Emily was still figuring out who she was, but Sarah could see the light returning in her eyes. She was learning to live for herself, to follow her own path. And for the first time, Sarah wasn't just cheering her on from the sidelines. She was right there beside her, showing her that it was okay to take up space to be seen. And then one morning, Emily invited Sarah to a small art gallery opening in town. Emily had taken up painting again, just like she had said. Her work was raw, emotional, and vibrant, and Sarah was in awe of how much of herself Emily had poured into it. They walked around the gallery together, surrounded by people admiring Emily's pieces. It felt like something out of a dream. "You've come a long way," Sarah said, her voice full of pride, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years. "I'm not there yet," Emily replied. But there was a confidence in her voice, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "But I'm getting there." "Just like you," Sarah smiled softly. "We're both getting there." They stood together, side by side, as people continued to admire Emily's work. And for a moment, everything felt perfectly right. But life, of course, wasn't just about art galleries and quiet mornings. As Sarah continued to step into her own life, things weren't always smooth. Old habits had a way of creeping back in. Her phone would ring, and for a split second, she would wonder if it was Mark. The weight of the years they had spent together, the way he had disregarded her, still lingered in the back of her mind. One afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Mark. It was her son, Matthew. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice cautious. "I know we haven't talked much, but I've been thinking. I saw some of your videos, the ones you uploaded. I wanted to check in." Sarah didn't know how to respond at first. Matthew hadn't reached out in months. He had distanced himself ever since she had begun to change. She had heard the dismissive tone in his voice when he had spoken to her about Mark. It had hurt then, and it still hurt now. But something had shifted within her. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. "I'm doing well, Matthew," she said, her voice calm, steady. "Better than I have in a long time." Matthew paused. "I know I haven't been the best son lately. Mom, I guess I didn't really understand what you were going through, what you needed. But I want to start understanding. I want to be there for you." For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. She had waited for years for Matthew to see her, but now with everything that had happened, she knew that her worth didn't depend on his approval. She had already found herself, still the softness in his voice. His sincerity was something she couldn't ignore. "It's okay, Matthew," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want to be seen. And I want you to see me too." The conversation wasn't long, but it was enough. It was the first real conversation they had had in years, and it wasn't filled with anger or resentment. It was just honest. They were finally starting to understand each other. Sarah's journey was far from over. She knew that. There were still pieces of her past she hadn't yet come to terms with, and she wasn't sure how long it would take for her to fully heal. But one thing was certain. She wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. That evening, as Sarah sat in her new studio, her own space, a room filled with soft light canvases and paints, she smiled as she picked up a brush. She had always loved painting. It had been her quiet escape, her way of expressing herself when the words weren't enough. Now it felt like a reclaiming a way of saying goodbye to the woman she had been and welcoming the woman she was becoming. The first strokes were hesitant, unsure, but then, as the canvas began to fill with color, something shifted. She painted with the confidence that had been buried for too long, letting her emotions flow freely onto the canvas. She didn't care if it was perfect. She didn't care if anyone else ever saw it. This was for her. This was her moment. When she finished, she stood back and admired the painting. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't need anyone else to validate it. She had given herself the permission to create, to live, to be. As Sarah placed the painting on the wall, she realized something. The journey she had started, the one that had begun with those divorce papers and the decision to be seen, was never about revenge. It was never about hurting anyone. It was about freedom. And that was the most powerful thing of all. The weeks rolled on like gentle waves, steady and calm, but the undercurrent of Sarah's transformation continued to shift the landscape of her life. She wasn't the woman she had been before. Patient, invisible, always putting everyone else first. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more self-aware. It wasn't that she had figured everything out. She hadn't, but Sarah had finally embraced the most important lesson of all. She didn't need anyone's permission to take up space. Her mornings were now filled with little joys, painting, reading, gardening, in the small patch of flowers she had planted just outside her cottage. She had started saying no to things she didn't want to do, and surprisingly, the world didn't collapse. The more she chose herself, the more she realized that life didn't have to be about pleasing others. It could be about living authentically, even in the quietest ways. Emily continued to be a constant in her life. They spoke, often shared little milestones and memories, and Sarah felt like she was finally getting to know the daughter she never had a chance to raise. Emily's art blossomed, and Sarah couldn't be prouder. They shared their struggles, their hopes, and their small victories. It was a new kind of family, a family forged from the fires of loss, regret, and the slow, steady process of building something real from the ground up. And then there was Lauren. Things between Sarah and her daughter had been strained, but they were slowly mending. Lauren still didn't fully understand, and there were moments when Sarah felt the old pang of disappointment when she saw the distance between them. But she didn't push. She didn't beg for it to be different. She knew that things would take time, but now she wasn't afraid of time. She had learned to take things one day at a time, one small, steady step at a time. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, as Sarah sat on her porch, the fading light of the sunset warming her skin, she thought back to the life she had once lived, the life with Mark,
The life where she had been invisible, where she had fought for recognition and love only to be met with silence.
There had been days when she wondered if she had made the right decision, if walking away was the right thing. But looking out at the peaceful landscape before her, she knew now. She knew she had done the only thing she could do. She had given herself the freedom to choose, and in doing so, she had given herself a new kind of power. Mark had tried to contact her a few times since their last conversation. There had been messages, emails, pleas for a conversation, for a chance to explain.
But Sarah had deleted them one by one. She didn't need his explanations anymore. She had given him decades of chances to see her, to hear her. And now, she was done. She didn't need him to recognize her. She had already recognized herself. That night, she made a decision. She didn't wait for Mark to come to her. She didn't need to confront him. She wasn't interested in the drama. Instead, Sarah packed a small bag. She wasn't running away. She was moving forward. She didn't know exactly where she would go, but for the first time, it didn't matter. The world was open to her, and that was enough. The following morning, as Sarah walked down the quiet street toward her car, she realized something she hadn't fully grasped before. She was no longer defined by what she had lost. She was defined by what she had found. Her own voice, her own strength, her own identity. She drove for hours, the road winding through hills and valleys as the sun rose higher in the sky. She wasn't running from anyone or anything. She was running toward herself. She was moving toward the future. She had always deserved, but had been too afraid to claim. It wasn't about escaping. It wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about the quiet power of letting go. The kind of letting go that freed her, that allowed her to breathe without the weight of the past suffocating her. She wasn't looking back anymore. There was no need. The road ahead was full of possibility, full of potential. As Sarah drove, she remembered something she had almost forgotten. A small cafe in a town she had passed by years ago. She had always wanted to stop to sit there and just enjoy the moment. She had never done it before. There had always been something else to do, someone else to please. But now, as she took the exit for that little town, she felt something inside her stir. She parked the car and walked into the cafe, the doorbell jingling softly above her head. The warmth of the place enveloped her, and she found an empty table by the window. The sun streamed through the glass, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah sat there alone, with nothing but herself for company. She smiled softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup as she thought about everything that had brought her here. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life she had made for herself. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. As Sarah continued on her journey, she found herself encountering moments of peace and turbulence. But through it all, she understood something deep in her bones. This was her life. She had taken it back. She had claimed her right to live authentically, to breathe without apology, to be seen. And the world responded in kind. Emily, once a stranger, had become a part of her life that she would never take for granted. Lauren too slowly began to see Sarah not as the woman she had expected, but as the woman she was becoming. Mark would always be a part of her story, but no longer the central figure. He had been her anchor for years, but now she was the one who held the power to steer her own course. It had taken years of sacrifice, years of silence, but Sarah was finally free, and the silence she had once feared as a mark of her invisibility, was now her sanctuary. It was in the quiet where she found herself. It was in the stillness where she found the strength to live for herself. And as the days turned into months, Sarah stood on the porch of her small cottage, watching the sun set once again, knowing that this time it wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of everything.